I'm going to go ahead with the meeting beginning ritual.
起立，面向佛堂，参加三鞠躬一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，参加各位点传师一鞠躬，开班一鞠躬，请坐下。Please be seated. We have a question that I touched on last time. I'm very happy to answer that question. So this question is about the many different versions of the Tao Te Ching. So someone who's recently getting into the Tao Te Ching is discovering the bewildering number of different versions out there. So the many different versions, I believe, that we see is the different translations, that they all seem very different. Most of that comes from the fact that the vast majority of translators do not know a whole lot of Mandarin, and therefore they have a lot of trouble with the original text. They usually rely on other people, but the quality of translation from other people is also not that great. So anyhow, when this gentleman is asking a native Chinese speaker about the different versions of the Tao Te Ching, his friend said that, well, it's because in ancient times there were many different versions of the Tao Te Ching. So that's what inspired the question. How come there are so many different versions? So to answer this question properly, I need to first set the stage. First of all, the nature of Tao Te Ching, I find, is not well understood. It's not well understood in the West, and sometimes it's not well understood in the East either. So it's not well understood globally. So what is its nature? Well, first of all, let me talk about what it isn't. The Tao Te Ching really is not some sort of holy book or scripture in the Western sense. It's not exactly like the Bible of Taoism. And I'll talk about the reason why that is. So the nature of the Tao Te Ching, stop thinking of the Tao Te Ching as some sort of holy book or scripture. There's nothing in it that's like, God's law commanding humanity. There's nothing like that. It's not like the Bible. It is, and was always meant to be a compendium or compilation of traditional wisdom. That's what it was. So think of it as the greatest hits in ancient times. So when Lao Tzu was asked to put something together, that's what he did. He picked the greatest hits of ancient wisdom. So the choice of words that I use there is very deliberate. Lao Tzu picked the greatest hits of the ancient wisdom. That is, he wasn't the one to create the greatest hits, but he was the one to collect them together in one volume, which became the Tao Te Ching. So it's a collection. That's what it is. So very important to note that the wisdom in the Tao Te Ching came from the Tao tradition, which meant that it came from the ancient sages who lived before the time of Lao Tzu, who lived before 2,500 years ago. It's not from Lao Tzu himself. He was the editor. He had an important role to play in that he put it together. He decided what to include, what to leave out. He was the editor. He was the one to assemble it. But the wisdom was not the wisdom of Lao Tzu, technically speaking, strictly speaking. It was the wisdom of the ancient sages who came before Lao Tzu. That's the nature of the Tao Te Ching. So when you understand the nature of the Tao Te Ching, the true nature, then there are many mysteries that used to be mysteries that just kind of fall by the wayside. They become easy to understand. So those mysteries become not so mysterious at all. For instance, there are historians who will say that Lao Tzu did not actually exist, that he was a group of people, that he was a whole bunch of different individuals, and that it was stitched together from different parts. Different parts were written by different sages and then put together. So Lao Tzu didn't actually exist. Well, what we know for a fact is that someone began the process of collecting and summarizing wisdom. Someone had the idea that, hey, listen, how cool would this be? Let's get the best wisdom together in one edition, one volume, summarize it. It becomes like a cheat sheet of wisdom. So it doesn't really matter to me who that person is. From historical sources, I have a great deal of certainty that person was known as Lao Tzu. But if you prefer, you can use Lao Tzu simply as the label for whoever the person was that started the whole process, that began the process of collecting and summarizing wisdom. What we know for sure is that there was a beginning at some point. Someone had the idea and started working on the idea. That's Lao Tzu. So historians who say that there were probably multiple authors, well, if it was started by Lao Tzu, whoever that was, it would subsequently be revised by other sages, anonymous sages. Most of those sages did not leave clue as to their identity, but nevertheless, they contributed to the project. So, of course, there were multiple authors because the idea to collect the greatest hits of ancient wisdom, that was easy to see. And Tao Te Ching was not the only work in ancient times that was done in that way. Before the Tao Te Ching, there was Shi Jing. Shi means poetry. Jing, classic. The classical poetry. And that was a compendium too. That was also a collection, a compilation of the greatest hits in ancient poetry. So this was no different. When people saw that this was the direction of the project, they would look at it and they would naturally say, oh, well, this is good, but you're leaving out this great hit of wisdom over here. This ought to be included. Or, hey, the order of these chapters, they ought to be reversed. Or, the summary here is not perfect. Here, let me write it in a different way. So, same idea, a whole bunch of people all helped out, all contributed to the project. Multiple versions? Well, of course. When you have something that's being revised, refined by a whole bunch of people over a long period of time, it's natural that you will end up with variations. Not a surprise. Not really a surprise at all. So this slide illustrates how understanding the nature of the Tao Te Ching helps you understand some of these so-called historical mysteries. Sorry, let me go back. Okay, moving on. So now I want to offer you a simplified chronology of the Tao Te Ching. So remember, throughout the history of ancient China, there were versions of the Tao Te Ching that came and went. Here's what we know. Here's what we know for sure. What we know for sure is backed by physical evidence, except the first one. The first one, about 2,500 years ago, the very first starting point of the compilation by Lao Tzu, whoever began the idea, it's lost in the midst of time. So nobody has a copy of that ancient one from 2,500 years ago. Now, fast forward 2 centuries. Now, 200 years back then is not like 200 years today. Today, things are rushing at breakneck speeds. Things are changing all the time. Back then, the speed was not so great. So in 2 centuries, there was just time enough for the first dissemination, first wave of dissemination of the Tao Te Ching all around ancient China. So it became pretty widespread. In 2 centuries, people got to know it, people studied it, and we know this for a fact because we see a copy of it that dates back 2,300 years ago from a place called Guodian. So Guo, this character here, is a surname. Dian is a store, that means a store. So this is the store of the family Guo, but it's actually the name of a place. It's the name of a place because in ancient times, there was a store there by the family, by this family. So Guodian, it later on became a tomb. So from 2,300 years ago, it was a tomb, and a tomb would usually house the body of an important person, like a noble, perhaps royalty. So those people, powerful, wealthy people, would often have things that would be buried with them. So from the tomb was unearthed the Guodian manuscript of the Tao Te Ching. So we know it existed back to that time because we actually have the thing. We have the physical object to prove it. And it's done on bamboo strips. It's a whole bunch of strips together with writing on it, assembled together to be sort of a writing medium, like a book or scroll. So that's from 2,300 years ago. This is what was discovered. Then, go forward about 50 years, 20 to 50 years ago, the Mawangdui manuscripts. Just like the Guodian manuscript, I mean, it's been too long, almost, more than 2,000 years ago, so the bamboo strips are incomplete. The Mawangdui, the manuscript from a different tomb 2,250 years ago was also incomplete. This time, it was not on bamboo strips, but on silk. So in ancient times, before the invention of paper, which was a couple thousand years ago, not quite back in those days, might have been like 2,200 years ago. So they were using silk to write on. And some of that silk has withered away in the course of time. So it's also incomplete. But both the Guodian and the Mawangdui manuscripts of the Tao Te Ching are useful as references. They prove that at least it goes back that far. So the account from 2,500 years ago, that's a historian's account, and historians in ancient times worked for the king or the emperor, and it was important for them to get their story straight, and that's the reason why I have a lot of faith in those accounts. Okay, so go forward another 50 years. So here we have a nice progression here, 50 years between this and this, 50 years between this and this. We have another manuscript, and this time it's complete. Heshang Gong. Heshang Gong, this is a person who lived by a river, and he was a hermit who cultivated by himself. And he studied the Tao Te Ching, and he made comments, he made commentary on it, on the meaning of the original text. So it's easier to work with than the incomplete ones here. The one from Mawangdui, it not only is incomplete, but a lot of the characters themselves look incomplete, like it was written down very quickly. And it might be, for instance, like a child's hand who's just learning how to write. So these all mark steps in the path of evolution from the original, that they're all a little bit different because people kept adding, rearranging, revising, but you can tell they're mostly the same. You can tell that they are the same work. So this situation continued on from the time that it was first written to about 7 centuries later. So about 1800 years ago, there was a young scholar who was known to be a prodigy. He collected all the manuscripts known to his world at the time, and he consolidated them. He collected as many as he could, including versions not available to us today, and he created a unified version based on the best ideas of all the revisions that people have made. So it was started 2,500 years ago. Different sages worked on it for 700 years, and then 1,800 years ago, all the different versions were combined together into the 81 chapters of the Tao Te Ching we know today. So just by looking at this simplified chronology, you can see the evolution of the compilation. So from 1,800 years ago to today, the version of the Tao Te Ching has remained unified. It's the same version. You'll find that different people may come up with a different word choice here and there, but the differences are minor and slight. The overall organization, the main thrust, the meaning of the chapters are the same. Now that you know the history of the Tao Te Ching, you can also gain insights. So, first of all, a question. Well, how do we know all this? How do we know for sure that these were actually found? Well, we do live in the age of the internet, so if you know where to look, if you have your Google searching skills handy, you can find all kinds of stuff. And let me show you what I mean. These are some of the bamboo strips from the Guodian find. It was not only the Tao Te Ching, it was also other remarkable ancient texts that were unearthed. So there are high resolution images available also. People that want to can actually zoom in and study ancient writing from ancient Chinese history. Of course, it's not very practical or useful today, but it can be done. And here we have something that is, not bamboo strips, as you can see. So remember, I mentioned that another tomb, in a different tomb from the Guodian, where the bamboo strips were found, in a different tomb, there was silk that had writing on it. Well, this is it. This is the Mawangdui. This is the manuscript from there. So a lot of it is lost. So these are the parts that are just gone, cannot be recovered. But the rest of it, you can extract the writing, veracity of some of these claims. All right, so I think this is actually quite important because I'm trying to say clarity is important. Those who don't, here's an example. Those who don't understand the history of the Tao Te Ching may assume that an older version of the Tao Te Ching must be better because it's closer to the original vision of Lao Tzu. I've heard that said many, many times, especially when there's, for instance, a translation of the Mawangdui version of the Tao Te Ching. People said that, well, this is very close to the original vision of Lao Tzu, and therefore this is more authentic. And I say, well, if you understand the nature of the Tao Te Ching, that it was an idea, a concept that was refined over time, then you can see it's not necessarily true that the older versions were better. Older versions were more like rough drafts, so they were unrefined. The basic idea is there, but wasn't fully developed. So yeah, you can say, well, there's this version and that version of the Tao Te Ching, but you can also see how you can look at the Tao Te Ching not as multiple versions, but one single thing, because it's one idea. That idea being, let's collect the greatest hits of ancient wisdom. It's one unifying concept, and it took the shape of what we see today in the Wang Bi version. Wang Bi, by the way, the prodigy, he died very young from sickness. He passed away at the age of 23, very young. So it's not actually multiple versions. It's actually one thing, one concept, one version, Wang Bi. Now, there are some who wish to make it more complicated. Now, what is the motivation to make something that's pretty simple, complicated? If you look at this, yeah, this idea, I can relate to that, the greatest hits, sure. Some do want to make it more complicated because it's ego-driven. Because by making something more complicated, you get to claim yourself as an expert, be seen as an expert into something that's highly complex. So it gratifies the ego. Some talk about the many different versions, frankly, to justify poor translations. So when a translation is inaccurate, they might say, well, this is based on a different version than the one that you have. Well, if you know all the different versions, then you can call BS on that. That pretty much is what I have done when I look at these different versions and people talk about that. Oh, there's so many versions of the Tao Te Ching. How do you know which version he translated from? And I will then tell them I actually know all the different variants. So now you know as well. Let's go ahead and do the meeting ending ritual, everybody. 起立，面向佛堂，持架深鞠躬，一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，持架各位顶传十一鞠躬，斜翻一鞠躬。Well done, everybody. Thank you so much.